Scrutiny panel on antisocial behaviour this morning. My sincere apologies that I'm not able to switch my camera on today. I'm having internet problems, so I'm going to keep my camera off today. Can I ask the officers, before they speak, can they give their full name and job title before they comment? And can I ask that elected members, if you want to speak, that you raise your hands and then I'll invite you to speak. You're not limited on the number of questions that you can ask or comments that you can make. We've had an agenda circulated, so we'll start with item 1, apologies and substitutions.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Flanagan sends his apologies and I'm substituting for him.
Thank you for joining us today, Councillor Majuri. Does anyone have any declarations of interest? No. We'll move on to item number 3, the minutes from the 18th of January. Oh, sorry, Charlie, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, Charlie Haggerty, Legal Manager. I think we probably need a roll call just for the minute to minute who's in attendance. Sorry,
I forgot about that. Apologies. Yeah, Sheila, can we do the roll call, please?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chair. Councillor Maureen Benison?
Yes, I'm present.
Councillor Rob Davis?
Present.
Councillor Danny Gibson? Don't think he's here. Councillor Alistair McPherson?
Yeah.
Councillor Alistair Majuri?
Present.
And Councillor Alistair Tolamash?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. We have 5 members present, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. We'll move on to item 3, the minutes from the 18th of January. Does anyone have any comments about the minutes? Would anybody like to propose? I'll propose them. Anybody want to second them?
I'm happy to second them, yeah.
Thanks, Councillor McPherson. We'll move on to the report now, the review of housing and antisocial behaviour related policies. And Bryony, I think.
Yes, thank you. I'm Bryony Monaghan, Interim Head of Education and Independent Lead Officer to the panel. So the report today provides the panel with information on decisions from the panel meeting of the 18th of January and areas for consideration at the meeting today at 1.3 to 1.6 and 2.2. Panel is asked to note the information which will be provided today on partnership work with police and registered social landlords, note updates on consultation process and agree plans for consultation with HAG. And also to agree both the current proposed items and new items discussed today for inclusion in the report to Stirling Council for the 3rd of March meeting. Officers who are in attendance today be happy to answer any questions, and these include Chief Inspector Jill Marshall and Dan Hartles, I believe.
Thanks, Bryony. I've got a couple of questions I wanted to ask about on the report on page 4, 1.2. Can you tell us what the progress is on the survey for Engaged Stirling, please?
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we've the Engaged survey is ongoing. It has a few more days to run, but we have so far had 86 responses. Of those, 66 have reported some or major impact of antisocial behaviour. The majority responses for some impact of antisocial behaviour at this point. All categories that we've listed there of antisocial behaviour are represented in the responses, with the highest level being at the moment noisy neighbours and litter and fly tipping. 71 people who've responded replied to a question about their type of housing, and 47 of the responses so far are from homeowners. The responses are spread across all wards, although there's the smallest number for Forth and Endrick ward at the moment, but we still have time for more responses to come through. Majority of people have reported that so far that they were able to report antisocial behaviour when they felt they needed to, although there are some who said that they weren't sure how to go about that at that time. And of those who did report it, the largest number were reporting the situation had not been resolved. Of those that were resolved, half of the responses were resolved quickly within the first week of the responses to date. There's a question about how we can improve, and it's clear from the data that a large number of the people who've responded to the survey have provided suggestions, but there's no collation of that data yet until the survey is finished.
Thank you. And on page 4 again, on 1.3, regarding streamlined evictions, we had a conversation at the previous meeting where I raised concern about a streamlined eviction for people who had been convicted of domestic abuse. And I'd made it clear that I wouldn't want the council to evict a family who had been subjected to domestic abuse. I did have a look at the appendix that you'd given us about the allocations policy, and it made reference to my concerns in there. Can you just clarify what the circumstances would be for a conviction for domestic abuse, please, Stephen, if you can answer that?
Yeah, it's Stephen Clark, Chief Officer for Housing. We'd had a discussion within the team about the query because it's often a case-by-case thing. It's hard to be clear-cut about this. My colleague Stephen McCabe is on the call and he'll maybe speak to it in a bit more detail, please, Stephen.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Stephen. Stephen McCabe, Housing Allocations Team Leader. Stephen kind of picked up on the point there that what we would do when we'd be looking at evictions would be looking at cases on a case-by-case basis to determine the most appropriate course of action, rather than take a blanket approach. So in situations involving domestic abuse, what we would want to do is to try and protect and support the victims as much as possible, and to try and resolve the case without resorting to evicting them. And that's something that we would give very serious consideration to. It's difficult to give set grounds on when we wouldn't evict somebody, simply because each case has to be considered on its own merits. But in cases involving domestic abuse, or potentially even where a tenant has mental health or learning disabilities, for instance, extra support and consideration would need to be given as to whether eviction is the correct approach. I think it's particularly relevant in these circumstances as any person evicted with mental health problems or a victim of domestic abuse would be more likely to be found unintentionally homeless during a homeless assessment if we were to evict, and we would then have a duty to rehouse them through the homelessness legislation. So I guess in answering your question, it's really difficult to say we would or we wouldn't. We'd have to consider each case on its own merits, but I think we would try to avoid eviction for domestic abuse, absolutely.
Thanks for clarifying that, Stephen. Councillor McPherson, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I do. It's very much regarding that, and Stephen Clark will be aware of the case. I'm dealing with a case with domestic abuse where the male is the one who's been physically abused, and the problem here is it's a joint tenancy, and neither of the two of them want to move out. So without going into the specifics of that case, the male has been asked to contact the police about it. So, which is it's not it's a solution that's not working for anybody here. So you've got two people living in a house, and so what do we do in a case where they're joint tenancies? Because this one's creating me enormous anxiety.
Thanks, Councillor McPherson. I think we've also got Chief Inspector Jill Marshall on the call as well. So maybe she would want to comment on that as well as Stephen.
Yeah, but can you hear Stephen's side first, Chair, because
Councillor McPherson. Yeah, Councillor McPherson, I was wanting to ask Stephen Clark to respond and then Jill to give comment as So, thanks.
Yep, thanks for the question. I think in this case, you know, obviously if there's you know, someone affected by domestic violence, they are a joint tenant, so they do have tenancy rights. We would generally, depending on the case, we would generally be able to provide homeless accommodation to someone affected by that. The difficulty is if neither party wants to leave their home, because it's not a straightforward process to try and evict a joint tenant. It's not a very straightforward thing to do because they do have significant rights. My colleague Stephen McCabe might have further information on that, but as I say, we would be providing homeless accommodation assistance to a victim in that kind of circumstance. Stephen?
Thanks, Stephen. I'm not sure I've got much to add to that, Stephen. I think it is or would be an extremely difficult situation, and certainly providing temporary accommodation through our homelessness services would be one way of approaching it. An alternative potentially would be an application through the transfer list as well. We do give a significant amount of priority in terms of points to victims of domestic abuse on our waiting and transfer lists as well.
For homeless accommodation.
Yes, if it's temporary accommodation, Councillor McPherson, we do have more ability to move people. As a Scottish secure tenant, you would have more rights within temporary accommodation. You only have an occupancy agreement, so we can move people more easily.
I'll deal with this more offline, because that's what you're telling me in theory is fine. In fact, this case is not working, but I'll take it offline.
Thank you. Chief Inspector Marshall, did you want to add anything to what Stephen's just said?
I suppose that the other influence that we might have is through the MARAC or the MATAC process. If the domestic abuse or violence situation has got to the point where it reaches that threshold, then, you know, housing colleagues would be round that table to look at the protection of victims and discuss whether, and I don't know about this specific case, but in general terms, whether the housing option is appropriate. And I guess the other slightly different element, but equally challenging matter would be that if somebody appears in a custodial setting for a domestic situation, there may well be bail conditions preventing them returning to that tenancy. So again, there may be something whereby the hand is forced by the courts putting a bail condition in place, which I appreciate is out with our gift or anybody else's gift, but it's certainly worth bearing in mind that might have an impact as well.
Thank you. Councillor McPherson, are you happy to take this offline now?
Yeah, yeah, because the responses, I've been dealing with this now for several weeks, and the male victim still subject to domestic violence. It was his tenancy originally, my understanding, and this individual moved in with him. So yeah, I'll take it offline.
Okay, thank you. I just want to go back to the report on page 5, 2.2. It talks about the work that Stirling Council is doing with RSL. In my experience of reporting antisocial behaviour or any issue really with some of, but not all of the RSLs that Stirling have, I really have, one of them in particular, Fourth Housing, I really have been met with a real stonewall approach from Fourth Housing when I've been reporting antisocial behaviour and issues. The last time I basically got an email from Fourth Housing telling me that Stirling councillors have no jurisdiction over Fourth Housing, and therefore I have absolutely no right in asking these questions, even though the tenant had signed a form giving me permission to speak to the Fourth Housing on their behalf. Can you tell me what should elected members and what should tenants do in the situation when they're just not having their concerns answered by their housing provider?
Yeah, it's worth stating in terms of how RSLs work that they have got the specific duties to address issues of antisocial behaviour. However, I'm aware that our community safety team will support landlords in addressing antisocial behaviour in terms of providing advice and assistance, but won't provide sort of support for court cases, that kind of thing. I don't know. I see Dan Hartles is on the call. You might want to speak to more just about experiences with working with RSL such as Forth.
Yeah, thank you. Dan, can you pick up on that, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Thanks, Stephen. Dan Hartles, Team Leader for Community Safety. Stephen's right in his initial answer there that the responsibility for antisocial behaviour within registered social landlord properties rests with the RSL themselves. We do provide advice and guidance to registered social landlords. It is very much advice and guidance. We have no powers to take over a case from them, for example, so we can't take action on their behalf. Where we do get people who contact us and say we've got concerns about how our case has been managed by our RSL, we will always reach out to the landlord, ask what's happened with the case, ask for that assurance. Ultimately, if somebody is unhappy with a response from an RSL, then they would need to follow that RSL complaints process. Obviously, RSLs are answerable to a board, and they have similar powers to us in terms of what action they can take involving their tenants. The bulk of where we do get involved is where it's an RSL tenant complaining about either a council tenant in the main, and that's where the team become involved. Obviously picking up on the action of a council tenant.
Thank you. Councillor McPherson, did you want to ask a question?
Thanks, Chair. It's in relation to the Scotland officer's comments there, John Marshall, about bail conditions and such like. I'm just reading the email here. It'd be good to know from Stephen Clark the jurisdiction over this, right? If there's bail conditions preventing somebody from coming near a property, right, under a joint tenant, surely if the bail conditions, I don't know how some of these are, a lot of these are kind of time, they're restricted and such like. So what would we do if this person, the joint tenant, the perpetrator of the violence in this case, I don't want to be specific here, comes near this property? Do they phone the police and the person's arrested? Because that's a breach of bail conditions. But it says here, that they still retain rights as a joint tenant. It seems bizarre, that they're being restricted from the near the property, but they still retain rights as a joint tenant.
Thanks for the question. I see Charlie and Stephen McCabe have both got their hands up, so I'd maybe defer to Charlie Haggerty in the first instance to respond to that.
Charlie, do you want to come in and answer that, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. You're right, Councillor McPherson. Breach of bail conditions are a criminal issue, and if bail conditions are breached, then police should be informed, and that matter will be taken back to court. And if it's found that in itself stands alone as a criminal offence, because the court has imposed a restriction effectively through those bail conditions, which prevents that person from returning to a particular locus, and that will probably be the locus where the victim resides. So that would trump any obligate or any rights to reside within that home for the period that those bail restrictions are in force.
Chair, can I come back on that? Because surely at the end of the day, if there's a bail order preventing them from returning this property, that should extinguish their tenancy rights. Surely. That to me is where there's a bit, and this is where we're talking about temporary accommodation here. Right? There's a grey area here, why? To me, they're making themselves deliberately homeless. by, you know, their actions, so much so that a court has imposed bail conditions on them, surely that the person's tenancy rights are extinguished. That should be the case.
Sorry, Charlie, did you want to respond to that, or Stephen McCabe?
No, I'm happy to respond to that. Thank you, Chair. The panel has to recognise that someone being placed on bail isn't someone being found guilty of an offence. And there's a presumption of innocence until such a conviction happens. So in those circumstances, and I understand where Councillor McPherson's come from, but in those circumstances it would be iniquitous to remove any other civil rights, such as the right to reside on property, on the basis of an untested criminal charge. And the criminal charge will be tested at the point when there's a trial and the sheriff convicts or does not convict. So at that point, that's when a decision will be made, perhaps by Stephen and by the team as to what they do when there is a conviction for the offence. But up to the point where there's a conviction, there's a presumption of innocence, and we couldn't be taking away people's other rights based on that.
Thanks, Charlie. Does that answer your question, Councillor McPherson? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, to a certain extent it does, but at the same time, they're all saying the law's an ass. At the end of the day, you've got an unsavoury situation here with that. Quite clearly, the courts have imposed bail conditions to restrict people from going near a property, but they still enjoy tenancy rights, and there's nothing you can do because they've been convicted in a court, but the court feels strong enough to impose a bail condition. This is where this becomes really frustrating.
I think that's beyond the remit of this panel, Councillor McPherson.
Well, I think I was trying to lead in.
I share your frustration, but I do think that this is that's beyond the remit of this panel. What you're asking.
Well, I don't know.
So, pardon?
I don't know if it is, Stephen. That's the whole point of searching whether or not we could extinguish their tenancy.
It's not up to
bail conditions.
Councillor McPherson. Councillor McPherson, we've asked. You've asked your question and you've had a response, and you've said that you're going to take this offline as well. Okay, can we move on? You've said that you're happy to take this offline. Councillor Tolmark, have you got a question? Thank you.
I do, Chair, and please let me know if it's appropriate at this stage. And it's to do with the survey, and it's to do with gardens and the state of gardens of the properties, equally for tenants and for non-tenants. And a lot of people get very upset when their neighbours are not looking after the gardens, and that causes a lot of the tensions. So my question is probably too. The first one, has that come up in the survey in what we've done? And probably for Dan, what do we do actually to try and resolve that? Because in my experience, these situations get resolved and then they come back again, and they get resolved and they come back again, and they never really get resolved, and they cause a lot of tension between neighbours.
Dan, do you want to come in and reply to that? O'Brien, do you want to answer it? Thank you.
Apologies, it took me a wee minute to find some information that was relevant to the question about the survey. So there are elements in terms of the types of antisocial behaviour which may come through in some of the answers. For example, vandalism and litter and fly tipping that might be relevant to the state of gardens. There are also other areas that at the moment we don't have the detail behind until the survey is concluded, so there could be responses that relate to the points you were making. Councillor Tolman.
Thank you. And Dan, I think is going to answer.
Yeah, Dan, did you want to come back in? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Councillor, for your question. Dan Hartles, Team Leader for Community Safety. So untidy gardens, where it involves a council tenant, predominantly is a housing matter and is one we would refer back to estate management. initially for review of whether there were tenancy conditions that had potentially been breached, and the housing officer would follow that up. The mainstream approach that we would take, where it's not always involving a council tenant, is around the mediation side of it. So we would try and broker a mediation agreement or a good neighbour agreement between the parties. In terms of specific powers we have around untidy gardens outside of council tenancies, that there's no provision within ASB legislation that would allow us to tackle that. Even when I look at environmental enforcement powers, it's deemed private land, so we don't have any statutory responsibility or duty in terms of fixed penalty notices, for example, on private land. So predominantly, to just sort of summarise my answer to your question, is it's a mediation approach that we would take between neighbours to try and broker a resolution. And where it was involving a council tenant, we'd work closely with the housing estate management team around that to see if there were any tenancy conditions that would be affected, and obviously action could be taken by housing as and if appropriate.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Perhaps, Stephen, you could respond to that now, Stephen, because if it's a housing issue, or one of the biggest problems is there's a few individual OK houses, but blocks of flats. When then no one really takes on the responsibility of doing it, and they're quite big gardens in some of these occasions, and the neighbours get upset because it's never done. So it's really the question about what does housing do in that situation.
Yep, I can pick that up. Thank you. So we have
some of this was discussed. God, sorry. One of Stephen, hold on a wee second. We is that correct, Stephen?
Councillor Benison, unfortunately, your sound is breaking up quite badly. At least for me, I'm not hearing your question.
Right. Okay. Stephen, can you just reply to Councillor Tomac? I was making the point that we had discussed this at the previous meeting.
I think I can answer your question there, Councillor. In relation to council tenants who have untidy gardens or unkempt gardens, there is a condition within the tenancy agreement that requires them to keep their garden. I think the wording is a reasonable condition. So if there are particular issues, we have an estate management team who would get involved and would try and assist that tenant in fixing the condition of their garden. Often what we'll find is that there are other issues that maybe prevent them from tidying their garden. It could be they're elderly or they have some disabilities. We have a garden cutting scheme that we can refer people onto, so we can help in that regard. And we do try, as Dan alluded to, there's a mediation service if there's an issue between different sets of tenants. As it's a breach, or technically a breach of the tenancy agreement, we can issue warnings as well, tenancy warnings if it's an extreme case, and potentially we could cut the grass and recharge for that as well. You referenced flatted accommodation. What our housing officers and our estate management team will try and do if there's an issue with blocks of flats and closes in particular is work with all tenants in a block. Often what they'll try and do is to implement cleaning schedules if that's not kept to. I know that we've got a couple of blocks of flats just now where we're trialling cleaning the properties, so we've got cleaners going in and cleaning the closes because there are ongoing issues. So there's different steps that we can take to try and alleviate any issues.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And okay, the apology if this was discussed. I don't remember it being discussed before, but okay, thanks for that. Okay, thanks for the answer.
Thank you.
Chair, it's Sheila here. We're losing you altogether. I can't hear you.
Hear me? Okay. Sorry, this sound is dreadful. Hear me? Okay.
Hello. Perhaps another person should chair this meeting. Actually, I think we're not getting.
I've sent a written message.
Oh, have you, Moen? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, I agree, Councillor Thomas. It should be somebody that's not a member, and I'm not keen to do it because I'm a member of administration. It should be an opposition with the scrutiny of current council policy. If I lose Councillor Benison, you know.
Okay.
It's for the panel to agree who would like to chair it. If you can agree amongst yourselves until Councillor Benison can get connected again.
So I'm going to suggest Councillor D. Davies. Okay, would you do it?
I'm not keen because I just feel out of my depth on this topic. I just do not know the issues in detail.
I proposed Councillor Trauma.
Okay. Well, if the other councillors would agree with me doing it, okay, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, I'm happy to second Councillor Thomas. Yeah, my chats aren't available, but yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much, and I'm very sorry that Councillor Benison has these technical problems, and if they're resolved, perhaps she should come back and chair the meeting. So,
Chair, if I could just point out, it's Sheila McLean-Clark here. If Councillor Benison has any key points to make, she could do that through the chat facility, which isn't public, but other members could pick that up in the meantime. That would be helpful.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. So, please, can I ask the councillors on the call if they have any other questions that have not been addressed? Okay. So far, we've discussed the survey, and we've discussed questions that Councillor McPherson rose. Rose, if there are, please would you put your hands up? Okay. Excuse me, the Councillor McPherson.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think and I was going to pick up the chair for, I think she tried to misrepresent me on the previous item, which I think to me is I was going to take offline the specific case, but I still want to know whether, and this to me is a really, really important issue that really should be reported back if we can do it to full council, whether or not the council can either suspend the tenancy suspend one of the members off a joint tenancy or extinguish a joint tenancy if bail conditions imposed on them. That question went unanswered and the chair misrepresented me, I'm sorry. So can we do that? Can we suspend a joint tenancy or can we extinguish it if bail conditions are imposed on a person in a joint tenancy?
Okay. Thanks, Councillor McPherson, for that question. Stephen, would you like to please answer that for us?
Yeah, I mean, my colleague Charlie might want to go into a bit more detail around this, and I'd need to check as to the case that I think Councillor McPherson was referring to. I thought was a permanent tenant. I may be mistaken. It's something I'll have to check out about that. But and if it was a permanent tenant, I don't think we would be able to. I don't think we would have the power to do that. I think it's only the power of a court that could do that. You know, that these tenants' rights were put in place to give tenants very strong rights, which diminishes the ability for the housing service to take those rights away. It would be remaining with the court. Charlie might want to clarify that further.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, no, absolutely agree. I'm sorry and apologise if I wasn't entirely clear in my answer earlier. The presumption of innocence will prevent us from taking any action until there's a conviction. And until there's a conviction, there can't be said to have been a breach of the tenancy agreement. So in those circumstances, we won't have the power to terminate a tenancy simply because someone has been alleged to have committed a crime. It's just not the way it works, unfortunately. So until there's a change in law, which I have to be honest, I couldn't see coming, because the presumption of innocence is entirely fundamental to the operation of the criminal justice system in this country. So unless that happens, I can't see there being a situation where we would be allowed to take such action in the circumstances that you mentioned, Councillor McPherson.
Chair, can I come back very briefly? And I'm sorry to labour the point, that's a really important issue, this. So, Stephen Clark, you said here that being a permanent tenancy. Is it the same in temporary accommodation?
Thanks for the question. I'd have to clarify that with our homeless team. I think the fundamental thing that I would say about, regardless of if they're a permanent tenant or a temporary tenant, I will clarify that for the case that you are referring to with Green McNeil in terms of the homeless service. But we would never let someone remain residing in a situation putting them at risk of violence. Because of this, we would always provide alternative accommodation. The difficulty is that we could not remove somebody from a tenant, from their joint tenancy. That we don't have the power to do that, but we do provide alternative accommodation. Thereby avoiding someone being put at risk.
Okay, would it be possible, Stephen, if the following this meeting, you could send a paper or a short script of what you've just said, for the information, of the panel members here?
Yes, I can do.
Okay, thanks very much. Do we have any other questions? Because we probably need to invite Inspector Marshall. She was invited to this meeting to talk about the partnership work. We don't have any direct questions. And just wanted to welcome Councillor the Gibson to the meeting. Please, Jill Marshall, would you mind giving us a short update of what the police do in relation to the partnership working, please?
Yeah, absolutely, Chair. So if we're specifically talking about private space in terms of housing and council tenants, then the partnership element to that is quite strong. We work really closely with Dan's team, and what would happen is where there is a call to police about antisocial behaviour, whether that ultimately ends up being a criminal matter or not, then we would share that information with Dan's team in order that they can continue to build up a picture around about a certain property or certain tenants, if working towards ABCs, ASBOs, evictions, what have you. So we would share that information with them. We have a very specific information sharing protocol which pertains to sharing of information specifically related to antisocial behaviour. So that would allow us to share that information, and that would extend to details of where somebody has been arrested and charged in relation to an incident, perhaps given advice where it hasn't materialised to be a criminal situation, or in the case that we've kind of talked about where somebody has been arrested for an incident and there has been further bail conditions, etc. So we would share that back with Dan's team in order to make sure that their records are as up to date as possible. Now we have a local authority liaison officer. He is in touch with Dan's team probably multiple times a day. Dan and I speak a number of times in a week just to make sure that we are absolutely working together, particularly around about very problematic tenants or addresses. In furtherance of that, we have a joint tasking meeting which sits monthly, and we have a rolling action log in relation to that. The key element of that meeting is, as I say, these very problematic either addresses or individuals, and because of the membership of that group, we're able to have some very full and frank discussions about the joint approaches to dealing with those. In many cases, it ultimately ends up with a joint visit by where the enforcement team or housing officers and police officers will attend together. Or it may be that we simply agree that council are taking it forward because there's legal process and train and what have you. So we will have those discussions, as I say, on a daily basis, but more formally at that monthly tasking meeting, which allows us just to record the current agreement for how we'll progress certain events and incidents in relation to those addresses. In relation to, I guess, public space antisocial behaviour, which I appreciate is a slightly different animal entirely, but again, we work very closely, particularly with Dan's team and the wardens and the detached youth team to come together to bring each area of expertise to a particular area generally. So we've talked about in the past through public safety things like Kings Park or the Lee Hills or Mayfield, where there's been some very specific, often youth-related antisocial behaviour. So again, it's a slightly different way that we come together, but again, very still much a partnership approach to that. Obviously, the most long-running one being Operation Steadfast, which is very specific to the city centre, but again has a range of partners involved in that to try and tackle the various elements that make up some of the issues that we've seen. I was going to say historically, and I don't want to tempt fate, but obviously we've worked hard to kind of make some inroads in the city centre, which I'm happy to say have been relatively successful. So there's a number of ways that we do that, but the most important thing I think throughout this is the information sharing and just making sure that we know where both sides of that coin sit, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question, or if you want me to be specific about any other elements, please just ask. Okay, thank you very much, Jill. I'm going to open this up for other members to ask questions because that may be the way things come out. So do any other members have specific the questions for Jill here? You've done such a good presentation, Jill, that everything's fine. What would be useful is actually just ask for Dan to, you've talked about your relationship with the councils, it would be useful for Dan to express the relationship with the police, please, Dan.
Thanks, Chair. Really short answer from me this time. I echo the comments of the Chief Inspector. She's done a much better job than I can of summing up the partnership approach there. Certainly from the services perspective, what I would say is there's been a lot of work put in place over the last 12 months around tightening up on various processes and further developing that partnership work there. So certainly from my team, the view is the relationship with the police is very strong. Chief Inspector's talked about we talk on a regular basis, which is true, but that actually happens all the way down through the team. So officer to community cop level, those conversations are starting to happen much more regularly now. So really effective relationship from my perspective, Councillor.
Thank you. Just a question for Jill. If a member of the public or a tenant or somebody or whoever wants to contact the police, could you describe the best way for them to do that?
There's a number of ways, and we have produced some leaflets, and it comes back to a point that Bryony made from the survey about people not being sure about how to report things. And we did produce a leaflet which we've used at a number of these initiatives, Op Complement, Op Imagine, and it actually breaks down for people the different services which they might want to contact. So if it's in relation to littering or noise or criminality, so that's something that I could perhaps share back via yourself, Brian. It's something that we've produced and we've put through many a letterbox over the last couple of years. So yeah, there's a range of ways, Councillor. I mean, obviously, probably not the forum to rehearse some of the issues around about 101, but obviously for non-urgent incidents, that still remains the main avenue. The community police officers do have ward email addresses, and again they tend to share them out via the community councils and via yourselves. And again, if it's something that's a bit more long term and not an urgent matter, then they're happy to take an email which they can address when they're next in the office. Crime Stoppers, again, that tends to be more in the realms of intelligence. So when somebody thinks that somebody perhaps locally is involved in some sort of criminality, be it drug abuse or what have you, then Crime Stoppers is another avenue, and it will work its way back through to us via that intelligence piece, which we can then utilise. And again, that gives people the opportunity to do that anonymously if that's how they feel more comfortable. And obviously Treble 9, you know, some of the situations which I know you have been contacted about by your constituents, you know, are urgent and can be time critical. And so I would never ever, you know, suggest that Treble 9 is not appropriate for for antisocial behaviour. In some cases it absolutely can be. So there's a range of opportunities to make contact, and I will share that information leaflet across to Bryony.
Okay, thank you very much. And that would be the useful. Okay, Bryony, if we could see what that is. So we've now, the Jill has had the chance to speak to us. So yeah, before I go on to what we're asked to decide today, is there any other questions that a member would like to raise at this stage? I think the answer is not. So thank you very much for that. I'm just going to go through and just bear with me, because I'm just going to go through the recommendations that we have for this meeting. So we're asked today to note the information provided during the meeting on the partnership work with the police and the registered social landlords. We did have a discussion. We've had that. The contribution from Inspector Marshall, so thank you for that. We're asked to note the updates provided on the consultation process in agreeing plans for the consultation with the members of HAG. Could we just, Bryony or Stephen, could you just inform us actually where we are with that, please? Stephen, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Tolmash. It's something that I think Councillor Benison's also raised in the chat that you might want to refer to as well. So we had a HAG meeting not last Friday, but the Friday before then, and there was certainly a strength of feeling at that meeting that that HAG would like to have a say on this, and they would kind of like elected members on the panel to hear what they've got to say. We explained that we can't really have HAG members attend Ad-Hoc Scrutiny panel. That it would be more appropriate, we think, to have to invite ad hoc panel members to a special HAG meeting with tenants to listen to their concerns. I've been in correspondence with panel members just to clarify whether panel members are agreeable to attending a special meeting of HAG to discuss these issues.
Okay, so do the members here agree that we agree the recommendation that Stephen has just suggested? Okay. Excuse me, the Councillor Majuri.
Yes, I just got a quick. So for our special meeting for HAG, with members of the public be able to be invited to attend that special meeting and have their say one from each ward. And obviously not all 10,000, but or however many people are in in the constituency.
Okay.
From that, but yeah, if it's a special meeting, have as well, obviously you've got the tenant representatives, but obviously other people are impacted by antisocial behaviour as well.
Thank you for that question, Stephen. Do you think that's a practical thing that we could do?
Well, I suppose that in terms of the motion to council, it was specific in stating stating involvement of HAG. I don't think that would be. My feeling is that it wouldn't be appropriate to have that as a public meeting. I think that some HAG members may want to speak from personal experience, which is why it presents a concern that they may not be able to speak in the way that they could do if they were on a live, broadcast streamed from YouTube. I see that the Councillor Benison has expressed concern about HAG not being able to attend the Ad-Hoc Scrutiny panel, but it's more for issues in terms of data protection that we aren't recommending that. But we could potentially have a member of HAG to attend a meeting, but it probably, for sort of the fuller breadth of getting feedback, we would provide a report, but I think it would be beneficial to have members of the panel attending the special HAG to hear the feedback themselves. I'm happy to take views and comments about that. I'm just relaying the views that were expressed at the previous HAG meeting that I attended.
Thank you, Stephen. Before making a decision, bring in our Councillor McPherson, please.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, Stephen, you mentioned data protection. You don't expand what you mean by the data protection risks of somebody for HAG taking part.
I think the concern for me is that
personal data here. We're talking about where's the personal data risk? I don't get that. Sorry.
I think the concern for me is that if somebody wants to speak about a neighbour dispute they may have done, that could potentially be identifying a neighbour because they might be speaking from personal experience. It could really details of someone's address and so on. So that was the concern that I had. I'm happy to take a view from, I don't know, Charlie Haggerty may have a view on that issue as well.
Okay, please could you give us that view, please, Charlie?
Sorry, thank you, Chair. I'm just slightly laughing at the fact that I've been told I have a view on this, which is.
Oh, okay. Well, if you have.
No, it's fine. No. And actually, sorry, in response to Stephen's point, I think there is a real danger if people are coming to speak of their bitter experience that they actually stray into areas where they're starting to name individuals, or that the individuals can be identified from the information which has been provided, and we have to guard against that. I would agree with Stephen in response to Councillor Maturi's request in respect of having inviting other tenants or individuals along. The purpose of having the questions and the survey on the Engage platform was to allow that level of representation to take place and to allow that interaction to happen. And certainly what we can do is we can speak to our colleagues in communications to make sure that the existence of the survey on the Engage platform is reiterated through the Council's social media channels to try and garner in more evidence and more responses to that.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, no, appreciate. Yeah, it's difficult to have members of the public on panels or advisory groups. From that, I just know a few people are keen to be a bit more involved beyond the survey and just how and if they can go about doing that, but we can maybe take that offline.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Majori. The other members of the panel, could they express their view on what we've just discussed, please? If they have one. We have no other views then. So, okay, Brian?
Apologies, it was just to draw your attention to a view that Councillor Benison has expressed.
Yes, on the chat. Unfortunately, I'm just going to go into my chat. My chat's not coming up. Yeah, so thank you. I think if I'm getting it right, Councillor Benison is saying that we could attend the Hague meeting because it's not a public meeting. So is that the way forward for us then, that we as members of the scrutiny panel attend a special the Hague meeting? And would people support that? Yes?
Agreed? Yeah, agreed.
Okay, Councillor McPherson?
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so we agree on that. So please say we've agreed on that. And the last recommendation is to agree the recommendation in the other areas for inclusion in a report to Stirling Council for the meeting of the 3rd of March 2022. Is there agreement on that? The Councillor McPherson?
Yeah, Chair, I do agree with that. I do, however, want to take offline, not the specific, I think to be very clear about it, not a specific about any case, but I do want more information on joint tenancies, because I'm looking at legal guidance online here, which kind of doesn't really tie up with what Charlie says here. And I know it's different for a tent accommodation. My understanding is that tent accommodation can be slightly different. So I really want to touch base with them after this meeting and discuss it. And if we do have powers to potentially remove somebody from a joint tenancy and tent accommodation, I would like more information on that and potentially have it in the report to council. I don't know how we do that, but
thank you very much for that, Councillor McPherson. Stephen, could you reply to that, please?
Yeah, just to say, if Councillor McPherson maybe wants to wait at the end of the meeting, myself and Stephen McCabe will hang on and have a brief conversation with them about this, and we can look at what could be reflected in the recommendations of the report.
Thank you, Stephen. And would you let the other members know, following that, what you've discussed, because that would be useful for us. Councillor Majority?
Yeah, well, my chat's intermittent, but I was able to see a wee bit of what Maureen was saying, so I was just wanting to agree with Maureen, much perhaps defer point 3 until after the special Hague meeting.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Councillor Majority. So I think we've been through the recommendations and we've agreed them. So if there's nothing else to discuss, I think I'd like to thank all the members of.
Well, for just for clarification, are we agreeing to defer point 3? We're not agreeing point 3.
Sorry, please, could you repeat that, Councillor?
So are we agreeing to defer point 3 rather than agreeing point 3? Just for clarification.
We'll go back to point 3. So what do other members feel?
Chair, can I make a suggestion
Yeah,
for the panel to consider?
Yes,
I think probably Brian is going to say the same thing. There's certainly some aspects which have been discussed over the last few meetings of the panel, which officers can commence to start pulling together the report on, but we do need your agreement that we can do that, and that would allow the report to work to complete or to start the report to commence, and that would not prevent anything else being added in following the meeting with Hague, dependent upon that outcome. And I've got one eye on the reporting deadlines that we're against to get this to council for the 3rd of March. So I think, Brian would probably come in with some suggestions, but if you could perhaps take that into consideration when you're decision making, that would be helpful from an officer's perspective in trying to get a head start on this.
Thanks, Charlie. Brian, please.
Yes, thank you. It is the same point really I was looking to make, and it was just to draw your attention to 2.1 again, where we've got some items that we would be expecting to be included in the report to date from our earlier meetings and so on. And they were, so I'm just looking at that myself, that it would include basically a report on the feedback from the consultation processes and recommendations to develop policies or guidelines on local processes for streamlined evictions and sensitive lets. There was a further recommendation proposed to include consideration of additional housing points for victims of antisocial behaviour when the housing allocations policy is reviewed this year. So if those previous items could be considered and agreed, then that would allow the work to begin on the report and not to be concluded until after we have all the information that's been discussed today.
Okay, so I'm going to ask, okay, Charlie, could you please come up for us a form of words which allows the report to be progress, but also allows any input from our meeting with, okay, the HAG to also be included. So please, can we have some words to do that, please?
Yeah, happy to do that. I'll just put some in the chat. I'll type them out as I think them, and then Sheila will have them for the minute.
Okay, so we can all look at our chat function, and then we can come back to it. So we'll give you 1 minute or two to do that, please, Charlie.
This is Sheila McLean-Clark here, Chair. Just bearing in mind that the chat is not visible to the public, if I could ask either an officer or yourself to read out exactly what is in the chat when you discuss. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Okay, I was going to ask, okay, Charlie, to do that for us.
Yeah, I'll read that out when I've just.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. What I propose is that panel approves that officers commence production of the report to Council based on the matters detailed in paragraph 2.1 of today's report, and to further augment this with the outcome of the survey and the meeting with HAG after that information is available.
Thank you. Would members agree that the new wording for recommendation number 3?
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
Please indicate that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
McPherson?
Yeah, Chair, I would like, I don't have any problems agreeing to that, but if I do find out that we do have the power to remove a joint tenant from temporary accommodation, I would like to have the option of adding that into a recommendation to full council. So I'd like to keep that option open.
Okay, because we haven't had that discussion completely with Stephen yet. So, do you have any words to describe that, Councillor McPherson, or just accept that we've agreed that, okay, following your meeting, if...
Yeah, I'm pretty happy.
Okay, you're happy to go with the wording that we've had so far?
Probably, just a loose agreement. I'm pretty happy to officer that, no problem.
Okay, thank you very much. So, please can I conclude that we've now agreed a change of, okay, the wording for number 3, and we've agreed that. So, okay, thank you for bearing with us with the technical problems we've had today, and for Councillor, okay, the Benison, and